Well, Valentine's Day is here, and it's such a shame that we have to spend it so far from our loved ones at this time. So I suppose, what better way to spend Valentine's Day in a pandemic than to bitch about a semi-Valentine themed love movie? No points for guessing which one it is if you clicked on the title of this video. Now, as I'm sure most of you are aware if you are subscribed to my channel, I've made the strongest effort to establish myself as a very calm, collective, and rational individual who tries to bring some semblance of humanity to the heated, reactionary landscape of the internet. But if any of you have ever wanted to see me at my most critical and how I can get when I tear apart a piece of media that I truly despise, this is one movie that will provoke me. Now, I'm about to go on a long precursor speculative rant here, so if you want to skip that and hear me talk about the movie, you can go right here on my timeline. So I'm sure some of you might be thinking right now, what, this measly little cheapquel? Sure, it's widely regarded as one of the worst of Disney's direct-to-video lot, and justifiably so, but you'd have to be pretty pathetic or just an uncultured swine to rank this as one of your worst movies of all time. I admit that there was a point where I was on the Disney direct-to-video cheapquel hate train like the rest of the internet was. I grew up watching them like I know so many others did of my time. Some of them I thought weren't half bad, if not up to par with the originals. Others I noted were rather lacking in quality, to put it nicely. And by the time I'd seen about half of the ones that had been produced total, I stopped watching them because I was growing fed up with them. My feelings for them disappeared into obscurity, and I didn't even hear about the news at the time that Lasseter had pulled the plug on them, but my strong hatred for them resurfaced with the rise of the YouTube reviewing community, which helped keep them a popular hate target. But after much self-reflection and reevaluation, I left that bandwagon behind, and a big reason to why had to do with the 2018 news that Disney Toon Studios had shut down. But really, what's the point of me getting so worked up over a movie, even if it is a sequel to a movie that I love, that has so little substance it can barely even fill an hour-long runtime? Moreover, isn't it rather hypocritical of me to not only get as harshly critical as you're about to see me get, but also as such an advocate for not keeping bad movies alive by consistently talking about them? Well, for one thing, these types of movies tend to resurface in discussion in some form or another anyways. Such examples being things like Dave Lee's Down Under videos ranking a Disney animated classic next to its live-action remake, its direct-to-video sequels and spin-offs, and or an animated mockbuster. A couple of years back, in light of the news that The Hunchback of Notre Dame was in line for Disney's live-action remake treatment, I made a video defending the prospect of it. It was something that I was dreaming to see. Not to fix what may or may not have been broken with the original, but to expand upon what was already there. To really get deeper into the touchy themes that were already pushing the envelope at the time in an era where audiences might now be ready to process them even further. And it was one that I did believe had the potential to be great, not by getting by on recycled nostalgia, but being a product of passion, especially since Alan Menken came back to get re-involved on what he often said was his best score, and that the team of Broadway legends behind it might possibly have the courage to push the envelope with it and have it tackle subjects relevant to our society today. And heck, in light of the news of the fire that broke out in Notre Dame just a few months later, part of it seemed like it was tied to the proliferation of the legacy of the original source material, given how Victor Hugo himself wrote the novel to advocate for some much-needed architectural restoration of the cathedral. My friend Mark Cabuzzi made his own playlist a couple years back where he hypothesized his own idea for what a remake to The Hunchback of Notre Dame might look like. And I sort of channeled my own vision for it as well, where I made 7 animatics to a select number of the songs to the stage musical version on my other channel. I'll provide links to both playlists below. Ever since the announcement of the news, I had convinced myself that even in the worst case scenario, the remake could never be even the slightest bit worse than the sequel, because even falling short of whatever potential it had, even at its most soulless and corporately manufactured, it would still at least be competent. Unfortunately, given how Disney has already announced not only remakes of nearly 75% of their animated canon, but also sequels and spin-offs to currently existing remakes, and given how Mulan 2020 was so badly received, both as a remake and as a movie, and has had so many upsetting behind-the-scenes details to boot, it just makes it increasingly hard for even someone like me to defend the decision to continue making them, since they just seem to be too often made for the wrong reasons to justify their existence. It feels like another one of those dreams that's destined to be lost down the drain. Like, even if the remake doesn't suck, will the end result even be worth it? And yes, The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 is admittedly just one of my personal kryptonites, which I know that every one of us has. I'm sure we all have that piece of media that triggers this nasty little voice in the back of our heads that says, how dare anyone try to defend what is objectively a piece of garbage against the more rational part of our minds. While I will admit up front that my bias is partially rooted in my love for the original, I don't know that I entirely subscribe to the widely shared theory that the more I love a Disney childhood movie, the more I hate its terrible sequel. I'm not one to pull the killed my childhood card because I've seen plenty of movies and shows from my childhood get a sequel or reboot that has made me cringe the whole while watching it. And really, more often nowadays, I've just taken to laughing when something has quote-unquote killed my childhood, because really no piece of media should be taken so seriously that one bad rendition has ruined your entire life, unless you just never spent a day away from the TV screen. This one, however, gets under my skin. It makes me feel a mixture of anger, sadness, nausea. I can't even look at clips of it without my stomach hurting and my skin crawling. Yes, even to this day, after I've disembarked the Disney cheapquel hate train. Perhaps the reason I take more issue with this one in particular is because I saw it as a kid, so it's had a longer time for the horrible aftertaste to linger and fester in my brain. And even as a kid, I did not like it very much. And that was a time when I wouldn't have exactly considered the original Hunchback of Notre Dame as my favorite Disney movie, though I have watched it plenty of times. And while I'll admit I'm not one to just go out of my way to go look for the worst thing I can possibly find, just for the sake of getting pissy, I have watched a number of movies that I've heard bad things about, even rewatching some of the worst movies I've seen in recent years, in an effort to exercise good faith critiquing. I've seen a bunch of Disney cheapquels in varying degrees of quality. I've seen crappy non-Disney cheapquels like Charlotte's Web 2, yes, that really exists, and most of the Land Before Time saga. I've seen low-budget bargain bin mockbuster crap. I've seen big-budget theatrical crap. And after all these years, I still hate this one more. I think it's worse than Chicken Little, the worst of Disney's animated canon. I think it's worse than Mulan 2. And I hated that one long before Doug Walker did his 2016 Disney December review that made it the hottest Disney-related trash fire to dunk on all of a sudden. Maybe it has to do with selective bias, even if it is an unconscious or involuntary one. I've gone through periodic spells in my life where, in order to try and deny any personal bias, I would try to find another movie to project more anger onto, which is not a productive use of my time or a sign of mental maturity. Making something else a target is never a good solution. I've let my thoughts about this movie out on DeviantArt in various forms, including a CinemaSins parody, making peace with it the best way I could, which was just to essentially try and forget that it exists. But now that I feel I've come such a long way, and now practice more at engaging in criticism that is constructive, that's what I'm aiming for here. As a quote that a friend of mine shared very eloquently stated, dislike a film all you want, then decide you're following rhetoric smartly. I suppose at the risk of the Hunchback remake coming out to a response of, this is worse than the sequel, hyperbole or not, or at the possibility of the sequel getting cancelled, I just have to let go my own feelings for the sequel all over again, even at the risk of me being a hypocrite. It was something that I debated talking about for months now, and finally I decided I just needed to do it for my own peace of mind. Because just a few years ago, when I didn't know how to articulate my rage toward this movie, it manifested into spite. Rewatching the movie several years later, my feelings towards it have not softened, but I have gotten better at articulating my discontent for it instead of just trying to spite it. Now let me start off by saying that as much as I know the hatred for Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 is widely shared, my personal disdain towards it is not for the reasons you're probably expecting. Yes, we all know it's a complete, utter downgrade from the original in every single imaginable way, from the tone, to the villain, to the songs, to the animation, which as it turns out was done by Disney's now-defunct animation division in Japan. Even putting aside the original, this sequel does channel a lot of very specific tropes and cliches that piss me off personally. And while people often refer to the love story between Quasimodo and his new girlfriend Madeline as cliché, predictable, cheesy, saccharine, etc., if it were just those, I wouldn't be a fan of it, but I probably wouldn't have near as much of an issue with it as I do right now. Unfortunately, there is an abundance of instances in this movie where the writing fails in some very, very basic ways, apart from just being cliched. Now, maybe you think I'm overanalyzing and getting excessively nitpicky, and I might very well be at times. This is just one of those movies that does that to me. Again, not just because it's a sequel to a movie that I love. If you're here because you hate the movie too and would like to hear me get super nitpicky about it, then enjoy. If you're someone who thinks that it deserves more credit than I'm giving it, feel free to enlighten me. If you're someone who just wants to hear me go off on some sort of hyper-emotional tirade, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. There are plenty of other videos you can click on for that. If you're going to attempt to hijack my comment section to say, no, talk about this sequel instead, this one's worse, you're out of here. This video is my trying to be collective assessment on this movie. Take it or leave it for what it is. Let me start off by saying that the biggest crime with the cheap production of this movie might surprise you. It's that it reportedly began production in 1997, just a year after the release of the first film, and was not released to home media market until 2002. Meaning that even if it was hastily put together over the course of a year, more or less, it still sat on the shelf for an extra 4 without any attempts to polish it up, and the result is as unpolished as you can get from the House of Mouse. Let me just mention this. Can you guess which other Disney direct-to-video sequel began production in 1997? The Lion King 2: Simba's Pride. Oh yeah, that's right. And that one was released to home video in the course of only a year. Let that sink in. And if that damage wasn't bad enough, guess who said that The Hunchback of Notre Dame was his favorite Disney movie? Michael Eisner. Yes, CEO Michael Eisner. The same guy who greenlit the direct-to-video sequel trend in the mid-90s, the same guy whom everyone likes to make fun of for being so wrapped up in the money-making part of his business and eventually got vetoed out of the studio. Let that also sink in. But really, the downgrade and low production values are not this movie's biggest problem. They are certainly its most obvious problem, but they're really just the tip of the iceberg. No, its biggest problem is why it was made in the first place. And it's not even that it's a cash grab, especially given how the original Hunchback of Notre Dame wasn't Disney's most lucrative or even most beloved property at the time. No, it's that the sequel is basically an apology detour that exists only to fix a popular topic of controversy with the original. That being that Quasimodo didn't end up with Esmeralda in the end. And the fact that a lot of viewers took this rather petulantly as a screw you if you're an ugly guy who's not a girl's first pick, instead of seeing it for Quasimodo showing enough maturity and selfless love for Esmeralda to put her needs above his own, and not be possessive of her like Frollo was, while still valuing her as his friend and recognizing how she has still helped him find what he really needed in the end, not just what he wanted. And that is a level of maturity that is not just rarely seen in most animated characters, but most fictional characters in general. Diva from Musical Hell summed it up in her review of the movie better than I previously could with, if they actually had to make this movie, then it's understandable why the writers would want to let Quasimodo have his own romance, but it should be something that comes organically out of the story itself, not its end-all be-all. Because it doesn't, the story ends up being a clumsy framework for the boy and girl meet under false pretenses, minor drama when deception is revealed, and reconciliation beats, and Madeline never emerges as a fully realized character so much as Quasimodo's designated trophy wife. Not to mention that it's not a very convincing attraction when she flees in terror at the sight of his face, and only warms up to him later when she sees him playing with Zephyr. Speaking of, Zephyr is another product of two rather egregious cliches, one being the love child of two characters from the first movie, in this case Esmeralda and Phoebus, and the other that being apart from being a hyperactive, loud, and obnoxious kid who never shuts up, he is dazzled by the villain's circus show and attempts to run away with him. And I just have to mention that here is a cliche that I have despised ever since I was young, and yet I don't hear it get brought up a lot. That being, a child has delusions of grandeur and blindly chases a fantasy, gets into trouble and needs to get rescued or bailed out of her predicament. Painting kids as being this stupid has always been what I felt is another degrading way of talking down to them. There are ways you can do it while making a kid look resourceful and genuinely passionate about the dream they're chasing, and that it's a worthwhile one, and then they have to think twice about their ultimate decision, and Coco is an example of this done well. Anyways, back to Madeline. Apart from being just a self-insert blank slate prize for the protagonist, the only other possible purpose she serves to the story is for Quasimodo to be the kind voice of encouragement in her life and to give her the gall to rebel against her abusive guardian, much like how Esmeralda was to him in the first movie. But apart from such paper-thin chemistry between them that just amounts to some terribly awkward, unfunny banter, Madeline's ultimate accomplishment is mastering her tightrope skills, during the film's sad excuse for a climax, to save the kid, which is something that Quasimodo should be more than fully capable of doing all by himself. Obviously, a better example of a female lead who has been sheltered her whole life and needs to discover her resilience to get out from under her abusive parent is Rapunzel. And if you want an example of being sheltered manifesting into the socially awkward but still excitable and eager to learn thing, this was again done better later with Anna. And speaking of abusive guardians, let's talk about that elephant in the room for a minute, as this movie's next big problem. Never mind the downgrade, Sarouche doesn't even deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as Frollo. He is the worst animated villain Disney has ever conjured up, apart from arguably Marina Del Rey from The Little Mermaid 3. But instead of just raving on that, let's speculate for a minute how a villain could have worked in this movie. When I was still very adamant on DeviantArt, I found this journal speculating a way that Hunchback 2 could have been much better, and one way was using the Little Mermaid 2 concept of villain from the first movie has a sibling who comes into the sequel to get revenge to its advantage. In this case, referring to the original Victor Hugo novel for Claude Frollo's briefly mentioned profligate brother Jehan. If Jehan were the villain of the sequel, his primary motivation would be a lust of power, not the same kind of lusting we saw from Hellfire if the writers don't want to get as dark as the first one, and that he's trying to emerge from Claude's shadow. He could have left Paris for several decades and then returned, having got word of his brother's demise, with ambitions to seize claim power to the city, and Madeline could be his pupil whom he's raised, manipulated, and kept under his thumb so that he could use her as a pawn in his ultimate scheme, pretty much the same way that Claude used Quasimodo. I mean, even if it doesn't match up to the badassery of Claude Frollo, it already works so much better and gives the story so much greater stakes than the city's Valentine's-like holiday getting crashed by a Narcissus-incarnated treasure thief who lusts over his self-image and aims to steal some jewel-encrusted bell. And speaking of that brings us to the movie's next big problem. The bell invented for this movie, known as La Fidèle, is meant to be a physical representation of this movie's obvious message, one which the writers apparently feel the need to sledgehammer the audience over the head with by adding some other scenes to showcase said message that include a deflated souffle that still tastes good, what seems to be a weed turns out to be rosemary, and others, as if they think the audience is too dumb to get it the first time around. This is bad enough on its own, but coming off the heels of a very mature, intelligent, multi-layered movie that did anything but talk down to its audience is a special kind of insulting. Now, I do not claim to be an authority on screenwriting by any stretch, and I would typically just go with saying something along the lines of, this story beat doesn't work for me, but La Fidèle showcases two specific examples of what I personally would refer to as bad writing, even for direct-to-video standards. One is the mere design concept of this bell, which even as a kid, I knew enough about sound to know that completely defeats a bell's purpose to serve its basic function. That's not me being nitpicky. If you want nitpicking, let me ask you who the hell would agree to squander all that prosperity on the interior of a bell where pretty much no one can see it? The other is when Sarouche and his cronies sneak into Notre Dame's bell tower to steal it. He puts up a curtain, chants a mystic mumbo-jumbo incantation, and presto, the bell is up and vanished. And later, when Madeline is held prisoner and spills the technicals of Sarouche's scheme, she reveals that he used the trapdoor technique that he's been using for his disappearing act during the performance that he used to dazzle his watchers who were getting pickpocketed by his goons. Yes, this movie is expecting its audience to buy that Sarouche snuck the bell tower out of Notre Dame's bell tower, all the way down into the sewers, through a trapdoor. That's literally their only explanation. And no, I'm sorry, that's not something that's contingent on the audiences being able to suspend their disbelief. It's a sign of writers who did not proofread their script. I don't even know if I can call it a plot hole since that term has been thrown around and frequently misused so much anyways. Other characters from the first movie return and aren't given much to do. Esmeralda's apparently in this movie for no other reason than because she was a primary character in the first movie. Also, her eyes have changed color, and she serves no purpose in this other than to give Quasi advice when he's either lovesick or moping and doping about being single. Clopin comes back and only gets 3 minutes of screen time tops, which is not going to make his fangirls happy. Jolly the Goat comes back only to tag along to Zephyr and be the love interest of the gargoyle Hugo. Speaking of, yes, the gargoyles also come back. Now, I admit I'm in the camp of people who are not the biggest fan of them in the first movie and consider them to be prime examples of out-of-place comic relief characters that spew pop culture anachronisms, even though I can see why some might enjoy them, and I myself did have some plushies of them when I was very young. But I could always buy into the writer's intentions that they were figments of Quasimodo's imagination all along, even in places where the movie was stretching that notion. Like, I could buy that Quasi was imagining that they were helping him ward off soldiers during the siege on Notre Dame. In this movie, any excuse for them being imagined has been completely chucked away, from the fact that Madeline and Jolly become aware of their liveliness, to how they also become integral to the progression of the plot at points, like being the first to witness Sarouche stealing La Fidèle and sounding the alarm. And while I'm not the biggest fan of A Guy Like You, I will gladly take that over any of the songs in this movie, especially the Gargoyle song here. I'm not kidding. The last time I watched this movie, I had to mute the volume when this song came on because I hated that much. The one thing I can give this film credit for in this movie is that they actually do commit to probably the funniest thing we've ever seen from them in their existence. Towards the end of the movie, anyways. That is one of only two good things I can say that are in this movie. The other being a moment or two between Phoebus and his horse Achilles. And speaking of Phoebus... that brings me to the final problem with this movie that I want to talk about, and perhaps the one that sparks the most rage in me. Now, I do have to admit right up front here that part of my rage here is rooted in some personal bias, because I've always been an adamant defender of Disney's version of Phoebus, and always believed that he was an underrated character who got a lot of undeserved flack from audiences for quote-unquote stealing Esmeralda from Quasimodo. Which I think is really such an insidious thing to say that implies that Esmeralda is really more important as the object of others' affection rather than her own person with her own agency. There's really no reason why Esmeralda shouldn't fall in love with Phoebus, because it turns out that he was the least prejudiced of all the major characters in the first movie. After all, he was the only one to stand up for Esmeralda even before he knew her, and showed sympathy to the plight of all the Romani, despite being summoned to do Frollo's bidding. He was basically trusted by none of the other good guys at first, and he still showed enough nobility to go out of his way to save an innocent family at the expense of his career and his life, and do it again to save all Romani and the Court of Miracles. He also saved Quasimodo's life at the end, and was a good sport to him the whole way, all without really expecting anything in return. He was never out to win Esmeralda from anyone. Their love for each other was just something that happened naturally and organically over the course of events, and was born out of their sharing passion for justice. So I admit it has been refreshing to see audiences' appreciation for Phoebus begin to grow over the years. I also have to admit that it's also been kind of refreshing to see more comments online expressing issue for the sequel's portraying of him, because quite frankly, this sequel takes a big steaming dump on Phoebus's character. He is really subject to some of the worst Flanderization I have seen of any character, and no, I haven't forgotten about Mulan, Mushu, or Shang in Mulan 2. Not only does this movie frequently hand Phoebus the idiot stick, it jumps into this out-of-nowhere subplot of him having an openly xenophobic predisposition towards traveling performers, and Esmeralda somehow ascribes this to racism against her and her people. Almost like the movie wants Phoebus to be the villain of the movie, in a similar vein to Frollo. It's not even what one can call accurate to his asshole nature of his character in the book. It feels more like what that Phantom of the Opera musical sequel, Love Never Dies, did to Raoul. It feels like a teen girl took hold of the script and decided, I'm gonna make the handsome guy into a total jerk-ass just to make the deformed guy look better. The only other possible conclusion I can draw from this is that this was an attempt to do the same thing as with Simba in The Lion King 2, where he was both a helicopter parent and a rival with Zira and her pride and needed to learn a lesson. But apart from the fact that it made sense that Simba would be untrusting of a bunch of lionesses who were, well, supporters of his murderous uncle Scar, the movie also gives him a moment where he makes the effort to open up to Kovu and consider him possibly worthy of being accepted before the big reveal where shit goes down. Not only is Phoebus never given a real reason to be any more prejudiced against circus travelers than he was to the Romas, he's also never given any moments to reconsider his prejudices. Instead, there's a scene where he goes to interrogate Sarouche about robberies and just blindly buys into his story that Madeline is the real thief, just so the plot can have Sarouche make his big getaway. And what was all of this building up to? A last-minute apology from him to Esmeralda during the resolution where he says, I was wrong about all of it, despite the fact that he was not. All his preconceptions of the traveling circus and Madeline's initial intentions were true, and either way, it doesn't make him or the movie look any smarter as a result. Regarding the character whose heart is in the right place but still has their own unconscious prejudices they need to come to terms with, is something that, again, Disney did much better in more recent years with Judy Hopps in Zootopia. In the end, it looks like the only purpose of this subplot was just to provide some sort of filler to stretch this paper-thin story just a few minutes past the hour mark. Like I said, part of my hatred towards Hunchback 2 does have to do with the original, but not in the killed my childhood way. I'm not here to just regurgitate everything that everyone else has said regarding why this particular sequel sucks so much. I try to avoid playing the underdog favoritism card because, again, I don't want to fall into the trap of selective bias, but The Hunchback of Notre Dame is one of those films that a part of me just gets extremely defensive over in the back of my mind. I'm not exactly proud to admit it, but there was a period in my life where my love for the original Hunchback was growing stronger with each passing year, but I didn't feel I could share it, largely because I knew how controversial of a film it was, either for being a not faithful adaptation that was sanitized to fit the mouse's brand, something that even descendants of Victor Hugo publicly expressed distaste for, or because it went into potentially too dark and risky territory for its target audience. It was even the only movie from Disney's animated canon that got nominated for a Razzie. Yes, really. Not even the more revolted titles like The Black Cauldron, Home on the Range, or even Chicken Little got a nomination for a Razzie. Not that I put much stock in those award ceremonies anyways. And now that I found this vast circle of Hunchback fanatics, I admit there's also become this slightly juvenile part of the back of my mind that makes it feel at times like I can't stand hearing anyone give it anything that isn't praise. Or I can't stand listening to how I know it was controversial and not well received by many. Of course, I know there are a ton of other animated, sometimes overlooked gems out there worth defending, including from the Disney canon, but I do firmly believe that Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame deserved light years better than this shitty excuse of a sequel, as do its fans, well, the ones who are the most civil and rational anyways. From the severely low-quality production values, to the songs, to the villain, even disregarding how everyone has already said how the love story is so predictable and filled entirely with cliches, all of which are done badly. There's everything regarding La Fidel and the beautiful on the inside sledgehammer moral, the seriously underdeveloped relationship between Quasimodo and Madeline that exists just to fill a status quo, and the unneeded subplot of Phoebus being uncharacteristically racist, all being in service of a moral that falls flat on its face. And yes, I'm aware of all the cases I've made defending the art of filmmaking on behalf of the creators, even in some films that felt so cynical by their mere inception, because I know that it's not an easy job, and I can believe that there is always someone with a passion working on it. But this is one of those instances where whatever passion was put in was 9 times out of 10 not reflected in the final outcome. Even though it does reunite the cast of the first movie, when I watch this, the only thing I can think of is, these guys deserve to be reading off of much better scripts than this. When a piece of media doesn't have the strongest reception, sometimes a bad sequel or adaptation can be a death nail in its legacy. It can deter audiences' preconceptions about the original before they've even seen it. And if a sequel comes out to mediocre or atrocious reception to a market like straight to DVD where it's perceived more or less as exclusively for kids, it can send the original from the selection of DVDs on the shelf of your local market right into the bargain bin where it can get easily overlooked. The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 might not have been a death nail for the original per se, but it sure didn't do much in the way of favors for its legacy. And the fact that apparently the Blu-ray release of Hunchback in some countries contains both the original movie and the sequel on the same disc is just salt in an open wound. Even if the first movie wasn't popular enough to incentivize Disney to make a sequel for any other reason than to resolve the protagonist gets a girlfriend quota, the result is very rushed and unpolished, especially for something that came out 5 years after it reportedly was produced. You'd think that, if no one else, Michael Eisner would have pushed for something of higher quality, even just a little bit, that was a sequel to one of his favorite movies. But, oh well. I guess that would have just been too much to ask from a guy who was more of a man about business than a man about art. And he was shown the door out of the studio on not the best terms anyways, after his attempts to keep the studio afloat in the early 2000s without the aid of Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg, so I don't think there's much point in continuing to dunk on him. In the case of the sequel, I won't judge you if you like it, even if it is because you wanted to see Quasimodo find a love interest. And like I said earlier, if you think there are any overlooked merits about the movie worth crediting, I'll listen. But I will not ascribe to Quasimodo getting the girl as a defense for the movie being good or justified in its existence, because that, coupled with the lack of passion and care put into everything else in the movie, comes with the implication, to me at least, that the team behind the first movie should be ashamed of all the hard work and passion they put into it. And that, I feel, is a bigger insult to the first film than anything that has been said by its harshest critics, be they hardcore fans of the novel, Victor Hugo's descendants, or just common movie-going crowds. I would have originally also said that it's a bigger insult than anything that could be done by a remake, but as I mentioned earlier in this video, that mindset I initially harbored has been challenged as of late. Really, those are my own feelings about the movie anyways. I'm sure the people who actually made the original Hunchback of Notre Dame have enough pride in the work that they've done that cannot be deterred by anything. If there's one thing I'm extremely grateful to be among the Hunchback of Notre Dame fan base for, it's that its fan base has been one that has displayed such strong passion and love for it, and that was the big thing that made it as popular as it is nowadays, in spite of all of its detractors. And to some extent, because of the controversy that made it such a topic of discussion. I certainly don't see myself ever not hating Hunchback 2 anytime in the future, much less defending it as anything resembling a decent movie. But even if it does something as simple as get shown to someone who has never seen the original film and that piqued their curiosity to see the original film, that is an achievement, somewhat. And heck, if the Hunchback remake turns out to be somehow worse, but causes the detractors of the animated film to acknowledge its merits for once, and even consider that it's worth more than they initially gave it credit for, I guess that's one win situation for it. Either way, this video I made was just another form of catharsis and making peace with this movie, which has not been easy to do. And I'm not sure that I've had complete and total success with it. But as long as I'm trying to be wise about how I express my feelings towards it, I feel I'm doing myself a favor. That's all I really have to say on this right now, so take care of yourself and happy Valentine's Day.